The sound of gunshots echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood at 3:47 a.m., shattering the perfect illusion that had been Rachel Torres's life for 26 years. As she crouched behind her kitchen counter, clutching her cell phone with trembling fingers while sirens wailed in the distance, Rachel could hardly believe that the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle, who had attended every school play and graduation ceremony, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding just 2 years earlier, was now the target of a federal manhunt for drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The FBI agents who had surrounded their family home in suburban Denver were looking for Eduardo Torres, the man Rachel had always known as a devoted father and successful construction company owner, but who they claimed was actually one of the most dangerous cartel operatives on the West Coast. The bulletproof vest that Agent Maria Santos had insisted Rachel wear felt surreal against her chest as she processed the impossible truth that everything she had believed about her family was built on a foundation of lies, violence, and blood money. Rachel's world began to crumble 6 months earlier when she noticed her father acting strangely during what should have been a routine family barbecue at their home in Lakewood. Eduardo had always been protective of his family, but recently his behavior had become increasingly paranoid and secretive. He installed new security systems throughout the house, hired what he claimed were additional construction workers, who seemed to spend more time watching the street than doing any actual work, and began insisting that Rachel and her mother, Sophia, never go anywhere alone. When Rachel asked about these changes, Eduardo would dismiss her concerns with vague explanations about business competitors and jealous people who might want to cause trouble for their family's success. But Rachel noticed that her father's explanations never quite made sense, and that the expensive gifts he had been giving the family, luxury cars, designer jewelry, exotic vacations, far exceeded what a small construction company should have been able to afford. The first real crack in Eduardo's carefully constructed facade appeared when Rachel decided to surprise her father at his office with lunch on his birthday. Torres Construction was housed in a modest building on the outskirts of Denver, and Rachel had visited many times over the years to help with paperwork or bring her father forgotten documents. But when she arrived that Tuesday afternoon, she found the building completely empty except for a single receptionist who seemed nervous and evasive when Rachel asked about her father's whereabouts. "Mr. Torres is at a job site," the woman said, but when Rachel asked which site, the receptionist claimed she didn't have that information. More troubling was the fact that the woman didn't recognize Rachel, despite the fact that Rachel had met her several times before and had even attended the woman's birthday party the previous year. Confused and concerned, Rachel drove to the 3 construction sites where she knew her father's company was currently working, but found no sign of Eduardo or any Torres construction equipment at any of the locations. The foreman at 2 of the sites told her they had never heard of Torres Construction, while the 3rd site appeared to be completely abandoned despite being listed as an active project on her father's company website. Rachel's confusion deepened when she checked the company's business registration and discovered that Torres Construction had been officially dissolved 2 years earlier, meaning that whatever Eduardo was doing for work, it wasn't running the construction business she had grown up believing was the source of their family's comfortable lifestyle. That evening, Rachel confronted her father about the discrepancies she had discovered, but Eduardo's response only raised more questions. Instead of providing a reasonable explanation, he became angry and defensive, accusing Rachel of spying on him and demanding to know why she had been snooping around his business affairs. "You need to trust me, Mija," he said, using the Spanish endearment that had always made Rachel feel loved and protected. "Everything I do is for this family, but there are things you don't understand about business. Sometimes you have to make deals with people who aren't nice, and sometimes you have to keep secrets to protect the people you love." Eduardo's explanation felt hollow to Rachel, who had inherited her father's analytical mind and wasn't satisfied with vague promises and emotional manipulation. Over the next several weeks, Rachel began paying closer attention to her father's daily routine and gradually pieced together evidence that Eduardo was living a double life that had nothing to do with construction work. He would leave the house every morning dressed in work clothes, claiming he was going to job sites, but Rachel noticed that his boots were always clean when he returned home, and his hands never showed the calluses and cuts that came from actual construction work. More significantly, Eduardo's business meetings always seemed to take place at night, often lasting until the early morning hours, and he would return home carrying large duffel bags that he immediately locked in the basement safe that Rachel hadn't even known existed until she started watching his movements carefully. The breakthrough in Rachel's unofficial investigation came when she decided to follow her father one evening after he claimed he was going to a client dinner that would last several hours. Instead of driving to a restaurant, Eduardo drove to an industrial warehouse district on the outskirts of the city, where he met with a group of men who definitely didn't look like construction workers or potential clients. Rachel watched from a distance as her father supervised the unloading of several large crates from a semi-truck, directing the men with the kind of authority and expertise that suggested this was a routine operation rather than a one-time occurrence. The men treating Eduardo with a level of deference and respect that indicated he held a significant position in whatever organization they represented. But it was what happened next that made Rachel realize her father wasn't just involved in something illegal, he was involved in something extremely dangerous. As the men finished unloading the truck, a black SUV pulled up to the warehouse, and two men got out carrying what were obviously weapons. Instead of being alarmed by their arrival, Eduardo greeted them warmly and engaged in what appeared to be a friendly conversation before handing one of them a thick envelope. The man opened the envelope, counted what Rachel assumed was money, and nodded approvingly before shaking Eduardo's hand and returning to the SUV. The entire interaction had the practiced efficiency of a routine business transaction, but Rachel knew that legitimate businessmen didn't conduct meetings in abandoned warehouses with armed associates. Rachel's discovery that her father was involved in criminal activity created an impossible dilemma that consumed her thoughts for weeks. On one hand, she loved Eduardo deeply and couldn't imagine him being capable of the kind of violence that his associates seemed to represent. On the other hand, she was married to David Chen, a detective with the Denver Police Department, and she knew that her knowledge of her father's illegal activities put both her marriage and David's career in jeopardy if she didn't report what she had discovered. Rachel also worried about her mother Sophia, who seemed genuinely unaware of Eduardo's criminal involvement and would be devastated to learn that their comfortable lifestyle was financed by illegal activities. The situation became even more complicated when Rachel began researching the warehouse district where she had witnessed her father's meeting and discovered that the area had been the site of several drug-related murders over the past 2 years. News articles described a violent turf war between competing drug trafficking organizations, with bodies turning up regularly as different groups fought for control of distribution routes and territory. Rachel realized that her father wasn't just dabbling in minor illegal activities, he was apparently involved with organizations that killed people as part of their regular business operations, which meant that Eduardo himself might be capable of violence that Rachel couldn't imagine. Rachel's internal struggle intensified when she overheard a late-night phone conversation between her parents that revealed Sophia knew much more about Eduardo's activities than she had been pretending. "Eduardo, I'm scared," Sophia said, her voice carrying through the thin walls of their home. "The violence is getting worse, and I'm worried about Rachel and David. What if someone comes after our family? What if the police find out what you're really doing?" Eduardo's response was chilling in its casual acceptance of danger. "Sophia, we've been over this. The money I make keeps our family safe and comfortable. Rachel has everything she needs, and she'll never have to worry about paying for her children's education or taking care of us when we get old. Sometimes you have to take risks to provide for the people you love." But it was Sophia's next statement that made Rachel realize her mother had been living with knowledge of Eduardo's criminal activities for years. "I just never thought it would get this dangerous. When you started working with Miguel's organization, you said it would just be moving money, not getting involved with all these killings and territorial disputes. Now there are federal agents asking questions around the neighborhood, and I'm afraid they're getting close to figuring out who you really are." Rachel felt sick as she realized that both of her parents had been lying to her for years, and that the loving, protective family environment she had grown up in had been carefully constructed to hide a criminal enterprise that was apparently escalating toward violence. The next morning, Rachel made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She decided to warn her father that federal agents were investigating him, hoping that he would use the information to extricate himself from whatever criminal organization he was involved with before anyone got hurt. But when she confronted Eduardo with what she had overheard, his reaction revealed a side of him that Rachel had never seen before and that terrified her more than anything she had witnessed at the warehouse. Instead of showing gratitude or concern for the family's safety, Eduardo became cold and calculating, asking Rachel specific questions about what she had seen, what she knew, and who she had talked to about her suspicions. "Rachel, you need to understand something," Eduardo said, his voice taking on a tone she had never heard before. "The people I work with don't tolerate loose ends or security risks. If they think you know too much about their operations, they won't hesitate to eliminate you to protect themselves. The only way to keep you safe is to make sure you never talk about what you've seen or heard." The implicit threat in her father's words was unmistakable, and Rachel realized that Eduardo was warning her that his criminal associates might kill her if they perceived her as a threat to their operation. More terrifyingly, she wasn't sure whether Eduardo himself would be willing to protect her if his associates decided she knew too much. Rachel's marriage began to suffer as she struggled with the impossible burden of keeping her father's criminal activities secret from her police officer husband while also living in fear that Eduardo's associates might target her family. David noticed that Rachel had become withdrawn and anxious, but when he tried to discuss her obvious distress, she deflected his questions with vague explanations about work stress and family concerns. The deception was particularly difficult because David and Eduardo had always had a close relationship, with Eduardo treating David like the son he had never had and David genuinely respecting and admiring his father-in-law's apparent business success and devotion to family. The crisis that would ultimately expose Eduardo's double life began when Rachel discovered that her father's criminal organization was planning something that would result in multiple deaths and potentially harm innocent people. She overheard Eduardo planning what he described as a territorial expansion that would involve eliminating competition in a way that left no doubt about the violent nature of the operation. Rachel learned that Eduardo's organization was planning to attack a rival drug trafficking group during a family gathering, which would likely result in the deaths of women and children who had nothing to do with the drug trade but who would be present at the targeted location. Faced with the knowledge that her father was planning to participate in mass murder, Rachel made the most difficult decision of her life. She decided to warn David about Eduardo's criminal activities, knowing that doing so would destroy her family but hoping that it might prevent innocent people from being killed. The conversation with David was devastating for both of them, as Rachel revealed not only Eduardo's involvement in drug trafficking but also the fact that she had been keeping this knowledge secret for months while David continued to trust and respect his father-in-law. David's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger at Rachel for not telling him sooner, and finally a professional determination to ensure that Eduardo and his associates were arrested before they could carry out their planned attack. David immediately contacted his supervisors and federal agents, providing them with all the information Rachel had gathered about Eduardo's activities. Within hours, a joint federal and local task force was mobilized to conduct surveillance on Eduardo and his associates, with the goal of gathering enough evidence to arrest the entire organization before they could carry out their planned violent expansion. Rachel found herself in the surreal position of helping law enforcement officers plan the arrest of her own father, providing details about Eduardo's daily routine, his known associates, and the locations where she had witnessed criminal activities. The federal investigation revealed that Eduardo Torres was far more significant in the drug trafficking world than Rachel had ever imagined. Rather than being a low-level associate or money launderer, Eduardo was actually the regional operations director for a major Mexican cartel, responsible for coordinating drug distribution across 6 states and managing relationships with local criminal organizations. The construction company had been a front operation that allowed Eduardo to launder drug money through legitimate business activities, and the family's comfortable lifestyle had been financed entirely by drug trafficking proceeds. Even more shocking was the discovery that Eduardo had been living under an assumed identity for over 20 years. His real name was Eduardo Morales, and he was wanted in Mexico for multiple murders committed during cartel territorial disputes. Agent Maria Santos, who had been assigned as Rachel's liaison during the investigation, explained that Eduardo's criminal organization had been responsible for at least 37 murders over the past 5 years, including the deaths of rival drug dealers, potential informants, and innocent bystanders who had witnessed criminal activities. The organization operated with military-style discipline and used extreme violence to maintain control over their territory and intimidate potential competitors. Eduardo's position in the organization meant that he had personally ordered or authorized many of these killings, transforming him in Rachel's mind from a beloved father into someone she no longer recognized or understood. The planned arrest operation became more complicated when federal agents discovered that Eduardo suspected he was under investigation and was making preparations to flee the country with his family. Surveillance revealed that Eduardo had obtained false identification documents for himself, Sophia, and Rachel, and had been moving large amounts of money to offshore accounts in preparation for a permanent escape to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Agent Santos warned Rachel that Eduardo might try to force her to leave the country with him, and that refusing to cooperate might put her life in danger if Eduardo believed she had betrayed him to law enforcement. The night before the planned arrest, Rachel made the decision to warn her mother about what was going to happen, hoping to give Sophia the opportunity to distance herself from Eduardo before the arrests began. But Sophia's reaction revealed that she had been far more involved in Eduardo's criminal activities than Rachel had realized. Rather than expressing shock or dismay about Eduardo's true occupation, Sophia became angry at Rachel for cooperating with law enforcement and accused her of betraying the family for the sake of strangers who meant nothing to them. "Your father has given you everything," Sophia said. "A beautiful home, the best education, a wedding that cost more than most people make in a year. And now you're going to destroy him because you think you're better than the business that paid for all of it?" Sophia's reaction forced Rachel to confront the painful reality that both of her parents had chosen criminal activities over the safety and well-being of their own family. Rather than being an innocent victim of Eduardo's deception, Sophia had been a willing participant who had accepted the benefits of drug money while remaining willfully ignorant of the violence that generated their wealth. Rachel realized that her entire childhood had been built on a lie, and that the parents she had loved and trusted had been willing to expose her to danger and moral corruption in order to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. The arrest operation began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when federal agents surrounded the Torres family home while Eduardo was meeting with his lieutenant to finalize plans for the territorial expansion that would have resulted in multiple murders. Rachel had spent the night at a safe house under federal protection, but she could hear the gunfire and explosions over the phone as Agent Santos provided her with real-time updates on the operation. Eduardo and 3 of his associates barricaded themselves inside the family home and engaged in a 4-hour gun battle with federal agents before finally surrendering when tear gas forced them out of the house. The aftermath of Eduardo's arrest was devastating for Rachel in ways she hadn't anticipated. The federal investigation revealed that Eduardo's criminal organization had infiltrated multiple aspects of the community where Rachel had grown up, including local businesses, schools, and even law enforcement agencies. Several of Rachel's childhood friends had parents who were involved in money laundering operations, and some of her favorite teachers and community leaders had accepted bribes to ignore suspicious activities or provide information about police investigations. Rachel realized that her entire community had been corrupted by drug money, and that many of the people she had trusted and respected had been complicit in criminal activities that destroyed other families' lives. Media coverage of Eduardo's arrest was extensive and sensational, with news outlets describing him as one of the most dangerous cartel operatives ever arrested in Colorado. Reporters camped outside Rachel's home, seeking interviews about what it was like to discover that her father was a major drug trafficker. The publicity destroyed Rachel's privacy and made it impossible for her to continue living in the community where she had grown up, as neighbors and former friends treated her with suspicion and hostility, unsure whether she had been involved in Eduardo's criminal activities or whether she might be cooperating with ongoing investigations. Rachel's marriage to David survived the crisis, but it required extensive counseling and a long process of rebuilding trust that had been damaged by Rachel's initial decision to keep Eduardo's activities secret. David struggled with feelings of betrayal and professional embarrassment, as his colleagues questioned how he could have been so completely deceived by his father-in-law's criminal activities. The situation was particularly difficult because David had to recuse himself from any law enforcement activities related to Eduardo's case, limiting his ability to contribute to the investigation that was exposing the full scope of the criminal organization he had unknowingly been connected to through marriage. The trial of Eduardo Torres became one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in Colorado history, with Eduardo facing charges that included drug trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Rachel was required to testify as a prosecution witness, describing her discovery of Eduardo's criminal activities and her decision to report him to law enforcement. Taking the witness stand against her own father was one of the most difficult experiences of Rachel's life, as she had to publicly acknowledge that the man who had raised her was a dangerous criminal who had chosen money and power over the safety of his own family. Eduardo's defense attorney tried to portray Rachel as an ungrateful daughter who had betrayed her father for personal gain, but the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Eduardo's criminal activities and the violence associated with his organization. Recorded phone conversations revealed Eduardo discussing murders in casual, business-like terms, and financial records showed that he had personally profited from drug sales that had destroyed thousands of lives across multiple states. The jury took only 6 hours to convict Eduardo on all charges, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sofia Torres was also arrested and charged with money laundering and conspiracy, though she ultimately accepted a plea agreement that resulted in a 10-year prison sentence in exchange for her cooperation with ongoing investigations into the cartel's financial operations. Sofia's cooperation revealed the existence of additional money laundering operations and helped federal agents identify other family members of cartel operatives who had been involved in hiding drug proceeds through legitimate businesses and real estate investments. The investigation that began with Eduardo's arrest ultimately led to the prosecution of over 60 people associated with the drug trafficking organization, including corrupt police officers, complicit business owners, and family members who had helped hide criminal proceeds. The federal task force that handled the case described it as one of the most successful operations against organized crime in the region's history, with agents seizing over $40 million in cash and assets, along with massive quantities of drugs and weapons that had been destined for distribution throughout the Mountain West region. For Rachel, the aftermath of her father's arrest and conviction required a complete reconstruction of her identity and understanding of her own history. Everything she had believed about her family, her childhood, and her place in the community had been revealed as illusions built on criminal activity and violence. The comfortable home she had grown up in was seized by federal agents as proceeds of criminal activity. The college education that Eduardo had paid for was financed by drug money that had come from destroying other families' lives. Even her wedding, which she had always remembered as one of the happiest days of her life, had been paid for with money that was literally stained with blood. Rachel and David ultimately decided to leave Colorado entirely, moving to a small town in Vermont where they could start over without the constant reminders of Eduardo's criminal legacy. Rachel changed her name back to her maiden name and began working as a counselor for families affected by drug trafficking and organized crime. Her first-hand experience with the way criminal organizations infiltrate and corrupt communities made her uniquely qualified to help other families who had discovered that their loved ones were involved in illegal activities, or who had been victimized by criminal organizations that operated behind facades of respectability and community involvement. The work was emotionally challenging but personally meaningful for Rachel, as it allowed her to use the painful lessons she had learned from her father's betrayal to help other people navigate similar crises. She specialized in working with children and spouses of criminal defendants, helping them understand that they were not responsible for their family members' criminal choices and that it was possible to rebuild their lives after discovering that someone they loved had been living a lie. Rachel's story became well known in victim advocacy circles, and she was frequently invited to speak at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement officers and social workers who dealt with families affected by organized crime. 5 years after Eduardo's conviction, Rachel received a letter from him in prison, the first communication they had had since the trial. In the letter, Eduardo claimed that he had found religion and wanted to apologize for the pain he had caused the family. But rather than taking responsibility for his criminal choices, Eduardo's letter was full of self-pity and attempts to justify his actions by claiming that everything he had done was motivated by love for his family. The letter convinced Rachel that Eduardo still didn't understand the magnitude of his betrayal or the way his criminal activities had endangered and corrupted everyone around him. Rachel chose not to respond to Eduardo's letter, but she kept it as a reminder of the way criminal organizations manipulate family relationships and exploit emotional bonds to maintain loyalty and silence. She used Eduardo's letter in her counseling work as an example of how criminals often try to avoid taking responsibility for their actions by claiming that their illegal activities were motivated by love or necessity rather than greed and a desire for power. Today, Rachel works as the director of a nonprofit organization that helps families recover from the trauma of discovering that their loved ones are involved in criminal activities. The organization provides counseling, legal assistance, and practical support to help families rebuild their lives after being devastated by criminal prosecutions and the loss of assets that were purchased with illegal money. Rachel's work has helped hundreds of families navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges that come with learning that someone they trusted has been living a double life. Rachel's marriage to David ultimately grew stronger as a result of the crisis they navigated together, though it required years of therapy and honest communication to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by Rachel's initial secrecy about Eduardo's activities. They now have 2 young children, and Rachel is determined to raise them with complete honesty about their grandfather's criminal past, believing that children deserve to know the truth about their family history rather than being protected by lies that might eventually be exposed in painful ways. The most important lesson Rachel learned from her experience was that love and family loyalty should never require someone to ignore criminal activity or protect people who choose to harm others for personal gain. Eduardo had tried to manipulate Rachel's love for him into complicity with his criminal organization, and Sophia had prioritized financial comfort over moral responsibility and family safety. Rachel's decision to expose Eduardo's activities had been devastating for her family, but it had also saved innocent lives and prevented additional violence that would have caused immeasurable suffering for people who had done nothing wrong. Rachel still visits the cemetery where her paternal grandparents are buried, people who had immigrated to the United States with hopes that their descendants would build better lives through honest work and community involvement. Standing at their graves, Rachel reflects on how Eduardo had betrayed not just his immediate family, but also the sacrifices and dreams of previous generations who had believed in the possibility of achieving success through legitimate means. She draws strength from the knowledge that by exposing Eduardo's crimes, she had honored the values that her grandparents had tried to instill in their family, even though it meant accepting the painful reality that their son had chosen a path that led to violence and moral corruption. The experience taught Rachel that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are also capable of causing us the greatest harm, and that protecting truly innocent people sometimes requires making choices that feel like betrayals but which are actually acts of moral courage. Eduardo had built his entire life on the premise that family loyalty meant accepting criminal activity without question, but Rachel learned that real love sometimes means being willing to hold the people we care about accountable for their actions, even when doing so requires enormous personal sacrifice and leads to outcomes that no one in the family wanted or expected.